Chapter 2. 9 o'clock sharp, sharper indeed than the proverbial serpent's tooth, and Paul was standing outside the front door of 70 St Mary Axe, waiting for the bolts to be shot back and the wards of the massive, church door-type lock to be graunged around so he could slouch in and start another day. It was less than 9 months since he'd stood on this very step, and a single round red eye had glared out at him through the letterbox. He hadn't known about goblins then. It seemed like another life. The door opened, and behind the front desk sat a bewilderingly lovely girl, skin the colour of coffee and eyes like deep, dark pools. He'd never seen her before, of course. "Morning, Paul," she called out. "You haven't forgotten, have you?" "No, of course not." He stopped and then shrugged. "Oh, all right, yes I have. Forgotten what?" "Bastard. Rehearsal, 6 o'clock tonight. You promised you'd remember." Mr. Tanner's mother, "Call me Rosie," she told him, but Paul knew it wasn't her real name, was a thoroughbred goblin of impeccable ancestry, with her species' unnerving ability to shape-shift at will, when an even more disturbing habit of developing serious crushes on human males, in particular tall, thin, weedy-looking, feckless specimens like himself. Subtle as an explosion in a fireworks factory, she'd been after him more or less since the day he joined the firm. Every day there was a completely different beautiful girl on reception, but they all had the same hungry grin. That aside, Paul minded Mr. Tanner's mom least of all the inhabitants of the office, and when he'd found out a few months ago that he was part goblin himself, she'd asked him, rather touchingly, to be the godfather to her latest offspring, who'd been born a fortnight ago. Now, apparently, she was dead set on holding him to his rash promise. He wasn't looking forward to the experience, mostly because she'd been dropping all sorts of dark hints about what a goblin godfather had to do at the ceremony. All he'd been able to prise out of her so far was that it wasn't as dangerous as it sounded. "Oh, now Dennis wants to see you," she added, flashing him a smile which, under any other circumstances, would have turned his knees to jelly. "In his office. 5 minutes. Don't ask me what it's about." Paul nodded glumly and trudged down the long, gloomy corridors to his dog kennel office. He didn't know why Dennis Tanner, the firm's mining and mineral rights specialist, should want to see him first thing on a Monday morning, but he was sure it wouldn't be about anything nice. At best, it'd mean a huge great batch of aerial photographs of seemingly identical patches of featureless desert, which he'd have to scry for bauxite deposits. It sounded impressive, but all it meant was running his fingertip across the surface of the picture until he felt a mild electric shock, and then ringing the precise spot with black marker pen. It was one of the few magical talents he'd so far manifested, and, as far as unwanted gifts went, it was up there in his all-time top 10, along with socks and the latest Martin Amis in hardback. Having sloughed his coat, he checked his desk for memos, yellow stickies, post and other hazards. Just one today. A handwritten note from Professor Van Spee. From TCVS to PAC. "You have finally read the first chapter of the book I asked you to read 3 weeks ago. Accordingly, you are now in a position to help me with the Max Zadusky account. Dennis Tanner will want to see you at 9:05. You will be free again at 9:35. Kindly call at 16 Jowett Street, just off the Charing Cross Road, and collect a parcel for me. You will be back in the office at 11:15. Please come and see me." Paul read the note twice and then shrugged. Ever since he'd first encountered Professor Van Spee, he'd made a conscious effort not to let this omniscience thing bother him. So far he'd just about managed, but the strain was getting worse all the time. He was about to drop the note into the homebrew coal seam he called his filing tray, when he noticed a postscript he'd missed earlier. "P.S. Leave now, or else you'll be late for your appointment with Mr. Tanner." According to Mr. Tanner's mum and various other goblins whose word he was prepared to take on the subject, Dennis Tanner was related to him, something like his 5th cousin, thrice removed. The revelation had brought him no comfort whatsoever. Every time he saw Mr. Tanner, his first instinct was to run and hide. This wasn't anything to do with Mr. Tanner being half goblin. He looked mostly human, a bit like a freeze-dried child, with curly brown hair going slightly grey, big brown eyes, and his mother's horrible grin. It was rather more to do with Mr. Tanner being an unmitigated bastard. "Come in," he heard through the chunky panelled door. Mr. Tanner was in his usual place behind the desk, wreathed in blue cigar smoke like a tiny malevolent volcano. On the other side of the desk was someone Paul hadn't seen before. Paul was on the tall, thin side himself, but he was an obese dwarf compared to the stranger, who was wearing a perfectly ordinary blue suit, shirt and tie, but looked as though he'd been poked down the shirt collar like a pipe cleaner and somehow got stuck. He had a long neck like a turkey, and his head was absurdly too small for the rest of him. He had tiny round glasses and very short grey hair, like the bristles on a nail brush.
"You're here then," Mr. Tanner said. "Right. I'd like you to meet Frank Lairtides. I'm delighted to be able to tell you Frank's agreed to join us here as our new PR and media partner."
Paul immediately froze and stared at the newcomer with undisguised trepidation. PR and media had been Judy de Castelbianco's department, and 3 months ago Paul had, after a desperate struggle, succeeded in thwarting her attempt to subjugate the human race to her own people, the dream-inhabiting Fae. When last heard of, Countess Judy had been trapped on the Isle of Avalon, whence, Paul devoutly hoped, she could never return. The reason he was panicking now was that, according to Countess Judy, only the Fae had the innate abilities needed to perform the kinds of magic needed for PR and media work, in which case... Relax. It was a newcomer speaking, but it was hard to believe that such a friendly, pleasant voice could have come from the strange creature sitting at Mr. Tanner's desk. "I know what happened a while back. You needn't worry. I'm not one of Judy's mob." Mr. Lairtides smiled, and his whole appearance seemed to change. Instead of being a cartoon Frankenstein's monster drawn by L.S. Lowry, he became just a nice man who happened to be rather tall. "So you're Paul Carpenter," he went on, steepling his impossibly long fingers. "The chap who took on the Fae and won. Got to admit, I've been looking forward to meeting you." The fear started to ebb away, but suspicion remained. At the time, Paul had been left in precious little doubt by the partners that the defeat of Countess Judy, though quite possibly the salvation of the human race and civilised life as we know it, had been a nasty blow for the firm, and so far from being pleased with him, they had only just managed to forgive him for depriving them of the staggering sums of money she brought in every year. This Mr. Lairtides, on the other hand, appeared to think he had done something clever, and was pleased to meet him. Well, quite, Paul told himself. If I hadn't got rid of Countess Judy, Stick Insect Guy wouldn't have landed her old job. That's got to be the reason. Paul smiled awkwardly, unable to think of anything appropriate to say. Mr. Lairtides nodded and then glanced back at Mr. Tanner, who cleared his throat and looked down at his desk. If Paul hadn't known better, he'd have thought he was embarrassed. "The other thing," Mr. Tanner went on in a rather strained voice, not like his usual cheerfully abrasive self, "is we, my partners and I, have been giving some thought to your position in the firm. I take it," he added in a strangled sort of voice, "you're happy here at J.W.W.?" It'd have been rude to laugh, and obviously Mr. Tanner hadn't wanted to hear the truth, or he wouldn't have asked the question. "Yes, rather," Paul heard himself say. "Absolutely." "Excellent," muttered Mr. Tanner, "because we, my partners and I, we're very pleased with the work you've been doing for us. We think you've settled in very nicely." And here he paused, and maybe he closed his eyes just for a fraction of a second. "And so we'd like to promote you from junior clerk to assistant sorcerer, if you're happy with that." Mr. Tanner's dribble of words finally dried up completely, like the last trickle from a Saharan explorer's water bottle, and he buried his face in his hands for a moment. To his credit, he managed to pull himself together again in a matter of seconds. "You'll need more money, of course," he said grimly, "plus extra holiday allowance." He paused. "How much holiday do you get at the moment?" Paul thought about it. None. "Ah, right. Well, from now on, you can have 7 days off a year. Just be sure to clear the dates with me first." It was as though some huge invisible bird of prey was ripping the words out of Mr. Tanner's chest with its talons. "Also, you get a company car, a proper one this time, and there's other stuff too. But I won't bore you with it now." "Oh," Paul thought. "Oh, well, never mind." "In return," Mr. Tanner seemed to have cheered up just a bit, "we'll be looking for that extra bit of effort and commitment on your part. I mean, it's not going to be just a job anymore. You're joining the J.W.W. family, if you want to look at it that way. And the way we look at things is, we all pull our weight and do our best, and..." Mr. Tanner seemed to go all boneless, as though he simply couldn't go on any further, no matter what anybody did to him. "That sort of thing," he concluded. "Look, do you want it or not?" If Paul had really had a genuine choice in the matter, it'd have been different. But he didn't. He knew perfectly well that his parents had sold him to the firm just over a year ago. He even knew how much they'd got for him. Watching Mr. Tanner suffer, on the other hand, was the most fun he'd had in ages. Yes, please, he said quickly, and thanks. This means a lot to me. It really does. Mr. Tanner nodded. I bet. Well, there you are then, and I hope you'll be really happy. Now, you'd better get out of here and go and pick up that parcel for Theo Vansby before he starts giving me attitude for keeping you. And he shuddered from his toes upwards and looked away. The tall, thin bloke, Mr. Laertes, Paul remembered, smiled pleasantly and nodded. Glad to meet you, Paul, he said. I'll drop in your office later and we can have a chat. Right, Paul mumbled and fled while he still had use of his legs. He had to go and do Professor Vansby's shopping next, but instead he went straight to the front office, where the lovely girl was lolling in her chair, sharpening her fingernails with a farrier's rasp. It was you, wasn't it? Paul said. She looked up and frowned a little. Probably, she said. What the hell are you talking about? This promotion thing, you made Mr. Your son, you made him do it. The pay rise, the holiday. He stopped and looked at her. It wasn't you then? She shook her head. Sorry, she replied. Nothing to do with me. For some reason, Paul felt distinctly uneasy. Are you sure? Absolutely. I mean, she went on, if our Dennis is giving you a raise, I'm really thrilled, and of course you deserve it, and all that crap. But it's first I've heard of it. So it wasn't just you trying to... Paul stopped dead and turned beetroot. Mr. Tanner's mum giggled. Look, she said. Yes, if I thought it'd do any good, and if I could have made our Dennis do it, that's just the sort of thing I'd be capable of. But it doesn't work like that. For one thing, Dennis can't make decisions like that on his own. He'd have to clear it with the rest of the gang first. If I asked him to do this one small favour for his dear old mum, he'd tell me to piss off and die in a ditch. If you've just got a promotion, well, she added with a grin, maybe it's because they really like you and they think you're an asset to the firm. Or could there be some other reason? She added blithely. But it's none of my doing. Hope you're not too disappointed, she added, and her tone of voice had him out of the front office and half up the stairs before he realised he was going the wrong way. Annoying. 70 St Mary Axe had no back or side door. To get out onto the street, you had no choice but to go past the front desk, and Paul didn't want to have to run the gauntlet of Mr. Tanner's mum's industrial-grade heavy leering again. Trying to explain all that to Professor Vansby was, of course, completely out of the question, as was failing to obey a direct order from the great man. He hesitated like a rubber ball on top of a fountain, kept in place by the two opposing forces of fear and embarrassment. They make the world go round, you know, said a voice behind him. He spun round so fast he nearly lost all his balance and toppled backwards through the banister rail like an inept sniper in a western. Mr. Laertes, stick-insect guy, had materialised on the step below, and so offensively excessive was his height that he still towered over Paul like the London Eye. Where he'd come from or how he'd got there, Paul didn't even bother to wonder. According to the songwriters, Mr. Laertes went on, it's love, but that's just silly. Science would have you believe that it's a gravitational pull of the sun, but bless 'em, they've got research grants to justify, so we'll forgive them a little white lie or two. 7 large vodka martinis on an empty stomach will make the world go round for a while, but then you fall over and pass out, so it's a temporary expedient at best. Paul stared at him as though he'd just sprouted an extra head, although after 9 months at J.W, he might well have been able to take that in his stride. I'm sorry, he said. I don't quite follow. Embarrassment and fear, said Mr. Laertes. You were just thinking about them. He smiled, and Paul's bewilderment melted like grilled ice cream. So what if he didn't have a clue what Mr. Laertes was talking about? It just confirmed that he was a whole lot smarter than Paul, and Paul knew that already. The mainsprings of human motivation. You're afraid of getting looked at sternly if you turn up for your appointment with Theo without the parcel, but the thought of facing Rosie Tanner turns your spine to jelly. What you need, therefore, is a third option, right? Paul felt his head bob up and down, though he couldn't recall asking it to. No problem. Mr. Laertes inserted a splayed octopus hand into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a big, thick book that couldn't possibly have ever fitted inside it. Go on, take it, he said. It won't bite. You can have it, by the way. Plenty more where they came from. Frowning, Paul opened the front cover. It was a book of carpet samples, maybe 24 of them, with fibre backings and little sticky labels on the undersides telling you what they were. But not the whole truth, Mr. Laertes said. Bit more to it than that. 3 guesses, all right. They're carpet samples, yes, but carpet samples with a difference. A bloke in Muscat makes them for me. You just use them once and throw them away. Muscat, Paul repeated. That's in France, isn't it? Mr. Laertes smiled. Oh, man, he said. Oh, what used to be called the Persian Gulf. Still haven't figured it out. Fine. They're flying carpet samples. You just clip these 2 rings up in the middle, see, and take out one of the carpet squares and tap it very gently with the side of your left index finger. Abruptly, the carpet sample lifted into the air, levelled off, straightened out its creases, and hung motionless in the air in front of him, about 4 feet off the ground. That's a flying carpet, Paul asked breathlessly. Well, it's carpet, Mr. Laertes replied, and there it is, flying, just for once. A great leap of faith isn't absolutely essential. And before you ask, it's dead easy. You just stand in the middle of it and say where you want to go. Next thing, there you are. A nice little added bonus is the carpet zips along so fast, it can't be seen by the naked eye. Pretty neat bit of kit, though I do say so myself. You just got to be a bit careful about low doorways and unusually tall coffee tables. That's all. That's amazing, Paul said doubtfully. But I still don't see... Oh, Mr. Laertes' left eyebrow shot up. You surprise me. I'd have thought the guy who outsmarted Countess Juliet had figured it out for himself a while back. Hop aboard and it'll whiz you past Rosie's desk without being seen. It won't take you all the way to Jarrett Street, unfortunately. Even the best of them, that's the Bader Street Pile Wilton knockoff with the faint herringbone pattern. Its maximum range is only about 400 yards. That one you've got there, the light blue imitation Axminster, ought to get you out the door and 50 yards down the street. Well, don't just stand there gawping like that. Give it a go. But Paul was going to ask some pertinent question or other. Unfortunately, his subconscious had been trying to work out how far down St. Mary Axe from the front door 50 yards was, and a mental image of the bus stop flitted across his mind. Immediately he felt something jerk viciously at his right wrist, and a shield wall of air hit him hard in the face as he shot upwards and forward. Fuck, I'm flying, he thought, just like bloody Superman. Then something very hard and chunky slammed into his shoulder, and he dropped to the ground. When he came round, after a brief holiday from consciousness, he realised he was sitting on the pavement next to the lamppost from which the bus stop sign hung, and he was holding a small square of light blue carpet in his right hand. That, continued Mr. Laertes, who was leaning on the lamppost like an absurdly elongated George Formby, and he looked as though he'd been there all along, waiting for Paul to show up, is why it's better to start off kneeling or sitting on the carpet, like I told you. Only you had to know best. Maybe next time you'll try it my way. Also, don't forget the light tap with the left forefinger. It helps slow the bugger down so you don't get your neck sprained by the slipstream. Paul looked up to reply, but Mr. Laertes wasn't there any more. Several passers-by looked at him, and one woman made a point of crossing the street to avoid him. Couldn't blame her in the least. As he stood up, Mr. Laertes had forgotten to include unexpected high-velocity flight followed by a sharp blow in his list of things that he'd made the world go round. Odd since it was a doozy. Paul felt something heavy in his offside jacket pocket and instinctively reached in and drew it out. It was the carpet sample book, still far too big to fit in any jacket pocket ever made, but when he tried to put it back, it dropped in quite happily as though it was no larger than a matchbox. Gift horse's teeth, Paul told himself. Of course he knew that it couldn't possibly be real, but on the other hand, it didn't take much imagination to realise that if it did actually work, under certain circumstances, it could be amazingly useful. He shrugged. Mr. Laertes was, after all, a specialist in what Countess Juliet called effective magic, the point about which was that if you believed something was true, quite often it would be, assuming you'd first made out a sufficiently large cheque in favour of J.W. Wells & Co. He'd sort of got the impression from Countess Julie that he was one of the very few non-Fae who had the innate knack of doing effective magic, which perhaps explained why the carpet had responded so readily to him. The pain in his arm reminded him that sometimes a very strong but completely untrained latent ability could be more of a liability than an asset. What the hell? In any event, it got past Mr. Tanner's mum without rupturing any blood vessels through excessive blushing, so that was all right.
Paul found a rubbish bin and dumped the used-up carpet square. If only she could have seen him, his mother would have been so proud. Now all he had to do was find Jowett Street and pick up the professor's parcel. When he'd read the memo that morning and seen the words "just off the Charing Cross Road" and "collect parcel for me," he'd known immediately what to expect. Charing Cross Road was where all the funny little second-hand bookshops were. It was a sort of neighbourhood where eccentricity was the rule rather than the exception, and even a specialist in magical text and spell books would count as boringly normal. Obviously, therefore, the professor was sending him to collect a book. 16 Jowett Street, however, wasn't a bookshop at all. In fact, it was a small Italian cafe. Sensibly, he'd brought the memo with him, and he took it out and checked it again just to be sure. But there it was, unambiguous as a kick in the face, 16 Jowett Street. A little bell tinged as he walked in, and a short, stocky man with a perfectly spherical head, thick glasses and a grin that looked as though it was larger than his face, asked him what he wanted. He said. The short man laughed. "What do you want to eat?" he repeated. "Nothing," Paul replied, and then quickly he added, "Look, I've probably come to the wrong place, but have you got anything for a Professor Van Spee?" The short man's grin widened so alarmingly that Paul had visions of his face coming unzipped and falling off. "Ah, Theo," he said. "Uno momento, por favor." He vanished and then popped up again at the other side of the counter, holding a white cardboard box, the sort cakes are packed in. "Ecco," he said. "Zabaglioni alla romana." He thrust the box at Paul like a fly half passing a ball. "For my good friend, il professor. Buon appetito." Zabaglioni? That was some sort of Italian bandit, wasn't it? No, it wasn't. It was a cake, or trifle or something. Thanks, Paul said. How much do I... The man roared with laughter, as if the idea of paying for something was the funniest thing he'd come across in years. "Is on the house," he chuckled. "And something for you," he added. "Any friend of Theo's is a friend of mine." He lunged at Paul with some species of stew pastry, chocolate swathed and gushing cream at every splitting seam. "You sit, eat, have a cup of coffee, plenty of time," he said. And Paul, catching sight of the clock on the wall, realised it was only just gone 10, and he wasn't due to meet the professor till 11:15. Also, he hadn't had any breakfast, so there are no grey areas or complex moral issues where chocolate-covered cream cake is concerned. If one presents itself, you eat it. Simple as that. So he sat down with his cake, and the short man brought him a large frothy coffee with cocoa powder on the top, and while he was busy guzzling the shoe thing, a slice of exquisite-looking cheesecake somehow found its way onto the table just by his elbow, so he ate that too. And time passed swiftly and agreeably, the way it usually doesn't during the course of the average working day. A small part of him was trying to brew up a degree of indignation at being sent out like some kind of serf to fetch yummy puddings, and him a fully fledged assistant magician. But it was fighting a losing battle, and it knew it. So far, working for Theo Van Spee had been a tense business. Mostly he'd been summoned to the presence, given books to read, and been politely dismissed. And each time the process was repeated, the professor would look at him thoughtfully for 10 seconds or so, and tell him he wasn't ready yet. That was fine in a way. No filing or photocopying or prodding 8x4s of assorted bits of outback, or filling in bewildering forms. Nothing scary or disgusting or even particularly bizarre. Theo Van Spee was odd, of course, because everyone at JWW was odd. He was tall and thin and elderly and grave, so you hardly dared breathe in his presence, and his room was as dark as a bug. He had a great many ancient manuscripts, he'd explained, which would suffer horribly if exposed to the harsh glare of electric light. So the blinds were drawn, and the only illumination was a single oil lamp and a handful of chubby white candles. And of course he did have that unnerving habit of telling you things about yourself and other people that he couldn't possibly have known, not to mention his even creepier knack of seeming to know exactly what you'd been doing and what you were about to do, and always getting it absolutely right. But when Paul had been assigned to Mr. Wells Jr., he tried to maroon him forever in a small room with no doors or windows, and Countess Judy had tried to kill him in his sleep, and Benny Shumway had made him fight a dragon, albeit a very small one, and he killed it quite accidentally by tripping over it and sitting on it, and had sent him to the kingdom of the dead to do the daily banking, and Ricky Wormtorture had used him as live bait in his feud with Countess Judy, and shot him at point-blank range with a crossbow, killing him stone dead. Fetching cakes by comparison wasn't so bad after all, and neither, if he was going to be perfectly honest, was being sent to his office to read books, even if he couldn't make head nor tail of them. "Scusi," the short man's voice snapped Paul out of his contemplative daze. "Is 10:45. Thank you so much. Goodbye." No point even being faintly surprised that the short, round-headed man knew when Paul had to be back in the office. He got on, said thank you politely for the nice cakes, and left, taking care not to squash the white box with Professor Zabaglione in it. Mr. Tanner's mum was still on reception when he got back. For some reason she turned into a willowy Swedish blonde, but she changed shapes the way a daytime soap star changes outfits, so he wasn't at all fazed thereby. But she let him pass with nothing more intrusive than a further reminder about the rehearsal tomorrow evening. He started to climb the stairs, and on the second-floor landing he collided with Sophie, who was coming out of the room where the big laser printer lurked. She was holding a huge wad of papers, and of course he knocked them out of her hands all over the floor. "It's all right," she snarled as she knelt down to pick them up. Small, dark, painfully thin, enormous eyes, like one of those fish that live right down the bottom of the sea. "I can manage. What are you doing with the cake box?" "Something I had to fetch for the professor," Paul mumbled. He tried to gather a stray sheet of paper, but she blocked him with her shoulder and grabbed it. "My fault," he said. "I wasn't looking where I was—" "No," she said, "and I just spent half an hour getting them in order. But don't let it bother you. I'm sure you had really important stuff in your mind at the time." He wasn't sure he followed that. "What?" "Now you've been promoted." The word came out like the first hiss of steam from a volcano on the point of eruption, and Paul took a step back, felt the edge of the stair under his heel, and grabbed the banister to keep himself from toppling over. "So please don't let me hold you up," she went on. "I'm sure you've got an important executive meeting to go to, or clients to see, or expecting a really important call from Minneapolis or Dar es Bloody Salaam." She grabbed his ankle, lifted it like a farrier shoeing a horse, and retrieved a stray page from under his foot. "I just hope I haven't held you up too terribly much, that's all." It simply hadn't occurred to Paul that Sophie hadn't been promoted too, and his mind emptied of helpful things to say as though someone had just phoned in a bomb threat. "Look," he muttered, "it wasn't my idea, and you know what they're like. It's probably some horrible devious plan." "Yes, right," Sophie snapped. "They've doubled your wages and given you holidays and everything because they're toying with you, trying to lull you into a true sense of security. The bastards," she added with a ferocious scowl. That was just a merely tad more than Paul could stand. "Oh, come on, Sophie," he wailed. "Be reasonable. What do you think I ought to have done?" "Refused," she snapped. "Of course. Otherwise it's collaborating. But I don't expect you to see that." The same tiny cell of his mind that had got all stroppy about fetching cakes now speculated about whether she'd have turned down a pay rise if she'd been offered it. But Paul knew better than to pay any heed to subconscious troublemakers. I'm sorry," he said, "but I just assumed they'd promoted you as well because—" "Balls," she interrupted crisply. "You know perfectly well it's because you're a main, so obviously you get the promotion and the extra money and the BMW and the key to the executive toilet, and I'm stuck in the photocopier room copying bloody leases all morning. Honestly, Paul, I really thought you weren't like that. I really thought you had a shred of decency. Do you mind?" she added. "You're standing on my hand." Which was true, unfortunately. He hopped like a sparrow, and she made rather a show of rubbing her knuckles and biting her lips stoically. "Soph!" "Please don't call me that," she said in a voice that you could have smashed into chunks and put in gin and tonic. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd better go and sort this lot into order. Again." Paul opened his mouth for a bit more abject pleading, but it occurred to him that anything he said would only make things worse, and by now he must be late for Theo Van Spee. "Sorry," he mumbled, and charged up the stairs as fast as he could go, tripping over his feet once or twice because the light on the stairs had blown, until he was standing outside the professor's room. Just before knocking, he glanced down at his watch, 11:15 precisely. Then, just as his knuckles were about to impact on the door, it swung open, with the result that he tapped Professor Van Spee lightly on the chest, as though examining his tie for signs of dry rot. "Didn't predict that, though, you bastard," he said to himself by way of consolation. "Otherwise, you'd have stood a step to the right." "Please sit down," the professor said. "You have collected my parcel. Please put it carefully on the sheet of newspaper I have laid out on the desk." He did so, observing without being even slightly interested that it was the court circular page of the Montreal Herald. "You wanted to see me," he said. The professor nodded very slightly and sat down on his side of the desk. He was backlit by one of the chubby candles, which cast a pale honey-coloured halo round his shoulders, while effectively silhouetting his profile. Poser, Paul decided.
Since you have tackled the first section of the book I asked you to read, you are now ready to help me with my current project. I have to recalibrate a number of rather delicate thaumaturgical instruments, and I need you to work out for me the mean differences and standard variations. You have not brought a calculator with you? I keep one in the second drawer down on your left.
Excuse me, Paul interrupted, but there wasn't anything in the book about what you just said. It was all about the world being a biscuit and stuff. The professor sighed.
You opened the book and started to read. You glanced at a couple of paragraphs and then fell asleep. You had a strange dream, which you cannot now remember. Correct?
Paul nodded.
Excellent. We will begin with the differential field polarity gauges.
Van Spee reached across the desk, picked up a flat rosewood box slightly larger than a paperback book, and flipped the dainty little catches to open it. Inside, snuggled in frayed green baize, lay a pair of tiny little brass gadgets, with jaws and thumb wheels and bits that slid in and out, and scales of numbers lightly engraved in teeny tiny lettering, so faint and elegant and fine he couldn't actually read them. The professor picked one up, wound the jaws open, and blew on it very lightly. Then he picked a pin out of the lapel of his coat, whistled the opening bars of the Blue Danube, and held the sharp end of the pin between the jaws.
836, he said. Do you concur?
Paul was about to object that he hadn't got the faintest idea what the professor was talking about, when his eyes blurred over, the way they do when you've just been crying or peeling onions. But it wasn't anything like that, he realised. They were just out of focus, like binoculars someone else has adjusted. Parallax. They'd done it at school, but he'd been daydreaming as usual. He lifted his head a little and tried to concentrate on something a bit further away. When he reached the professor's brass gadget, he found it was perfectly clear, amazingly so, in fact. The minute little numbers on the thing's sides were as deep and broad as ditches, and the figures themselves were almost too big to recognise. He blinked, then noticed the point of the pin. It was crawling with tiny moving things, small and busy as ants, but darting about in a markedly orderly fashion, and in time to the professor's rather tuneless whistling. The ants, he said. Are they dancing?
Not ants,
the professor replied, and Paul realised they had little lacy wings like mayflies. The professor gave up the waltz and started humming Blue Suede Shoes, whereupon the mayflies stopped dead in their tracks for a split second and then began whirling around even faster. Jitterbugs? Paul asked.
No, the professor told him. Look carefully.
Not insects of any kind. They had minuscule legs and arms. They were even wearing claws, long white smocks like old-fashioned nightshirts. Beyond question they were dancing, though.
836, the professor repeated. Is that what you make it?
Paul wasn't aware of making a decision to count them. There was a moment when he quite simply knew that there were 817 of them. Presumably in his excitement he said the total out loud. The professor sighed.
19, he said. Too large a margin of error.
He moved a thumb wheel on a couple of clicks and said, Try again. He'd been right, not ants or mayflies, and even though the professor had stopped humming, they kept on dipping and whirling, waving their tiny arms about in time with the gap in nature where the tune had been. Angels, Paul said.
Correct.
The professor was peering down at the little brass gadget.
821, he said. Do you agree?
819, Paul heard himself say. Only 2 out this time.
That'll do, the professor said,
and he put the gadget he'd been playing with back in its box and took out its twin.
Now I make it 823.
21, Paul insisted.
Excellent, replied the professor. Down to a standard deviation of 2. That's very helpful.
He shook the pin like a nurse with a thermometer and went through the same procedure, holding it between the jaws of the gadget and fiddling with the little wheels.
852?
Yes, Paul said. I make that too. How come I can see them when they're so small? Either Professor Van Spee hadn't heard him, or he was deliberately taking no notice. He shook the pin again, and Paul realised he was clearing the angels off, then waiting for a new batch to settle on it so he could count them with the little brass doodad. This time round, Paul's total, he had no idea how he was doing the counting, was 3 less than the professor's, but that didn't seem to worry Van Spee, as he put the brass calipers back in the box and closed the lid.
Most satisfactory.
The professor finished making notes in a small red book and glanced at the grandfather clock leaning against the opposite wall.
Now you must excuse me for a moment while I use the dimensional abacus. Once I have finished the job, I shall know whether it needs returning.
The dimensional abacus looked like a doll's house harp, only round and with very small dots or blobs strung out on the wires. There were 8 of them, all different combinations of colours like marbles. There was a silvery one, and a red one, and a blue-green one, and further back a big brown one with a single dot, and one appeared to have a thin, sharp-edged disc around it. Professor, Paul started to say, but Van Spee was engrossed in what he was doing, teasing the balls along the wires with the tip of a biro. A tiny spark jumped across the frame, grazed the edge of the big yellow blob in the centre, and vanished in a bright blue flare.
Lefkowitz's comet, the professor explained, due to collide with Mars in 576 years' time. The result could have been substantial damage to the planet, resulting in a cloud of asteroids which would have bombarded Earth. A similar collision many millions of years ago led to the Ice Age, which wiped out the dinosaurs.
Paul nodded slowly. He was feeling numb from the shoulders up. But it's not going to happen now, he mumbled. Is it?
The professor dipped his head. A tiny alteration in the solar orbit of Neptune will cause the gravitational field of Jupiter to draw the comet 500,000 miles or so off its original course. This divergence will increase as the comet continues its journey. It will miss Mars by a comfortable margin, fall into the sun and burn up harmlessly. There will be some perceptible effect here on Earth, increased rainfall in the southern hemisphere for a year or two, and there will be bumper harvests of cocoa and soybeans in 2579, but beyond that, nothing of any consequence.
Paul breathed out slowly through his nose. And you did that, he said, nudging the blob things round with a pen.
In a sense, the professor replied mildly. This instrument, he went on, is somewhat akin to a computer mouse. By moving it, one can initiate parallel movements in the world outside. One can, for example, make minor adjustments to a planet's orbit. It's a modern adaptation of a very old system of procedures commonly known as sympathetic magic. The same system that makes it possible to harm someone by sticking needles into a wax doll. Simple as it seems, it is in fact a tremendously complex and involved process, requiring many millions of complicated mathematical calculations.
Right, Paul said, fascinated in spite of himself. Which is what you need the abacus for.
Excellent.
The professor's shadowy top lip moved a touch, as if possibly in a smile.
No doubt you've heard one or other of the popularized versions of chaos theory. The most commonly cited example is the butterfly that flaps its wings in the Amazonian jungle, thereby giving rise to storms and tempests over northern Europe. That is, of course, a gross oversimplification. However, the abacus may be considered as the equivalent of the butterfly in that scenario. The difference is that the movement of the ball bearing along the wire is deliberate and calculated with the utmost care and attention to all possible operating factors.
I see, Paul said, bending the truth like a bowstring. His head was hurting, a real force-8 little men with pickaxes job, but he ignored it. So I was right, and it was you that made Neptune get out of the way?
Of course not. I merely moved a ball bearing along a wire.
The professor sighed audibly.
Think it over, Mr. Carpenter, and it will come to you, I'm sure. Meanwhile, we must retune the abacus. I suspect it may be as much as 0.00000000000000000001 picohertz out of true, which for fine work would render it not merely useless, but dangerous as well.
Paul knew that he should know better, but he couldn't let it pass so lightly. Professor, he said, you just saved the world, and the human race and things. Isn't that
business?
A mild click of the tongue, a patient man tolerating the fact that his good nature is being taken advantage of.
You wish me to explain my motivations, Mr. Carpenter, when we should be recalibrating this instrument. However, he tutted, more in sorrow than in irritation, and shifted just a tad in his chair. I suppose we should clear up this issue now, before it causes problems. Mr. Carpenter, the procedure you have just witnessed, one small movement of a metal bead along a short length of ordinary fuse wire, was the culmination of over 300 hours of intensive calculation and research, and my time is neither infinite nor entirely without value. Why would I want to do a thing like that?
To save the planet, of course, Paul said, relieved that for once someone at JWW had asked him a question he could answer. Otherwise there'd have been an ice age and we'd all...
No, the professor was trying to be kind, but he wasn't finding it easy. For money, Mr. Carpenter. To make money for the firm's clients and for my partners and myself. There's no other reason one must earn a living after all.
Sure, Paul said, but the same way doctors get paid for curing sick people. But really...
Not at all.
There were tiny flecks of annoyance in the professor's bland voice.
We are retained by a major food processing and retailing multinational. They are aware that sunspot activity results in climate change, which in turn affects the growth of crops. A glut of any given commodity allows them to reduce the price they pay to their suppliers, which means increased margins and greater profits. Since even Vogmart cannot afford the cost of launching nuclear missiles at the sun, they hired us to cause sunspots. This I have done. The adjustment in Neptune's orbit will have an immediate effect, and next year there will be the required glut of coffee and bananas. The English summer will also be the wettest in 30 years, resulting in a rush of late foreign holiday bookings, which will justify the trust placed in us by our clients in the travel and aviation sectors. And that, he added, absently scratching his chin with his forefinger, is all there is to it.
But, Paul struggled to find the words he needed. You really mean to say that saving the world was, like, a coincidence? The professor's laugh was not entirely kind.
Hardly, he said. Economy of effort is the key to productivity and profitability. By choosing very carefully the timing and nature of my intervention, I was able, what is the proverb now, to kill multiple birds with one projectile. I told you just now there would be a bumper harvests of cocoa and soybeans in 2579. I shall still be very much alive when that happens, and my stockbrokers will still be in business. An investment of 25 pence now, suitably managed over the intervening period, will provide the funds necessary to buy a controlling interest in the commodities markets in good time for me to take maximum advantage of those exceptional harvests. In 2580, I shall be the third richest man on the planet.
Whatever it was Paul had intended to say to that, it came out as a muted whimper. The professor clicked his tongue again and went on.
Finally, there is a regulatory aspect to be considered. Our industry is governed by a voluntary ethical standards agreement. Basically, if we fulfill our quota of goods works, we are left alone by government. The agreement has to be self-regulating, since only we can understand it. We work on the honesty principle, like people who leave trays of tomato plants outside their houses and trust you to put money in a coffee tin when you take some. We fill our quota because we must, but it's entirely up to us to choose which good works we do. And today I have saved the human race from extinction 5 centuries hence. I will send a detailed report to the relevant department of the Home Office, and they will pass on my data to their scientists, who will eventually confirm, once they have progressed far enough in their understanding of astronomy, that Neptune did indeed shift in its orbit for no readily apparent reason, and that Lefkowitz's comet is currently on a collision course with Mars, and that the adjustments in Neptune's orbit has obviated that threat. There you see, 3 birds for my stone, all of which taken together exactly justified the expense of time and resources I have devoted to this project. In taking the time to explain these simple facts to you, I have regrettably reduced the profit element of the project by 0.413%, so I trust you will agree that we should now get on with the recalibrations without further delay.
That was Paul told, and for the rest of the day he helped the professor recalibrate the dimensional abacus, the mode reintegrator, the 3/8 serendipity wrench, the Wolgersang keys, and the self-centering entropy clamps. He didn't ask what any of these things did, and the professor didn't tell him. At 5:25 precisely, he tightened up the locking screws on the last clamp.
"Thank you," the professor said. It was the first thing he'd said for over an hour. You will be here at 9:70 tomorrow morning, and we will field strip the Emerson projector. Your front door key has slipped through a hole in the pocket of your overcoat, but you will find it trapped in the lining just above the bottom hem. As soon as Paul got back to his office, where his cord hung on the back of the door, he checked to see if the professor had been right. As he fished the key out through the hole in the pocket, he wondered if any of the things that Van Spee had told him earlier offered a hint of an explanation in how the hell he did that stuff. Someone who could shift the orbit of a planet. And then he frowned, because it had been rather hot in the professor's room, and there'd been a useful-looking electric fan on his desk. But when Paul had asked if he could turn it on, the professor had shrugged and said it didn't work. A man who could heave planets about, but who couldn't replace a blown fuse? And if Van Spee was really all-seeing and all-knowing, wouldn't he have realised that the fuse was about to blow? Or maybe he simply didn't feel the heat. He glanced at his watch and swore. 5:29. He really didn't want to find himself locked in, even though he wasn't afraid of the goblins anymore. Grabbing his cord, he jogged down to the corridors and made it to the front office just as Mr. Tanner was reaching for the top bolt. "Cutting it fine," Mr. Tanner growled. "Try and keep an eye on the time, will you?" Paul apologised and scuttled through the door as quickly as he could. Outside, it was bright and sunny, or maybe it just seemed that way after a day cooped up in the professor's office with the blinds drawn. On such a fine evening as this, Paul didn't feel like going home straight away to his sparse and miserable flat. There was already quite a crowd of people sitting outside the pub just down the road, and his throat was dry enough to justify a quick drink. A virtual coin spun in his mind and came up heads. It was a double-sided coin, but that's often the way. It took him a while to fight his way to the bar, and almost as long to thread his way back through the dense forest of drinkers without spilling his lemonade shandy. Worn out by his adventures, he propped himself up against the wall, just clear of the doorway, and took a couple of deep breaths. The warmth of the sun and the fiery strength of the shandy made him feel almost absurdly relaxed. No hurry to go home or go anywhere in particular. Being out of the office in blissfully normal, magic-free surroundings was solace enough. He might even stay a while, have the other half. Someone dug him in the ribs and he convulsed, slopping shandy all over his cuff. "Careful," said a voice he'd never heard before, but recognised immediately. "You're a bit jumpy this evening, nervous about tomorrow?" Mr. Tanner's bloody mother. Of course it was her, even though she disguised herself as a slim, flame-haired enchantress in a red sundress. "No," Paul replied. "I've just got this thing about getting stabbed with sharp fingernails. Did you have to do that?" "You look so sweet standing there," Mr. Tanner's mum replied cheerfully. "I couldn't resist. Haven't you got a home to go to, then?" "Yes, but it's horrible," Paul said. "It smells of cabbage and the plumbing makes disgusting noises. What's wrong with having a quick drink before I go home?" She tutted. "Touchy," she said. "Girl trouble?" "No, it isn't." The reply a tad too vehement, perhaps. Like he cared. "Nothing of the kind," he said stiffly. And anyway, won't be long now before I'm through with that stuff forever. Can't wait," he added, trying to look nonchalant as he sipped the foam on the top of his shandy. "You're joining a monastery?" Better than that," Paul said, "because I don't like getting up early in the morning, and I'm allergic to bee stings. No, it's much better than that. Thanks for asking." The gorgeous redhead frowned. "Why bee stings?" "Monks," Paul said. "They all keep bees, don't they? Anyway, screw bee stings, that's not the point. Pretty soon, my falling in love again, heart of glass days will soon be over. Ha, just you wait and see." Mr. Tanner's mum shrugged. "Oh, you mean that recipe you found in Theo's book?" she said. "That old thing, pure snake oil, doesn't work." Paul's stomach lurched slightly. "Oh, what do you mean it doesn't work? How do you know about it anyway?" "Oh, well," Mr. Tanner's mum grinned. "I know a lot of stuff, I do, and I happen to know for a fact that you can't brew that muck without the special secret ingredient, Van Spee's crystals. And of course you can't buy them anywhere, because only Theo knows how to make them, and he controls the supply." "That's what you think," Paul said, smirking insufferably, "because I've got some Van Spee's crystals. Loads of them." "Really?" Her tone of voice cut through the smug fug in his brain like a razor. "Where did you get those from, then?" There was hardly any delay before Paul replied. "Oh, I asked the professor for some, and he gave them to me, from a big jar on his desk. Very pleasant he was about it, but he did say not to tell anybody about it, or they'd all want some. So, if you wouldn't mind keeping it to yourself." "Sure," she nodded thoughtfully. "Well, that's lucky," she said. "Only he must like you an awful lot. You know how much that stuff is worth." "You just said you can't buy it." Scorn, intense enough to strip varnish. You can buy anything, Mr. Tanner's mum said, so long as you've got enough money. How much did he give you then?
Oh, about an ounce, I suppose? Like an aspirin bottle full?
Bloody hell! Not often Paul saw Mr. Tanner's mum lose her cool. You may be interested to know. Your mate Theo gave you enough stuff to buy a 4-bedroom detached house in Surrey. Pretty remarkable, don't you think? He must fancy you or something. Paul ignored that. He had other things to worry about. True, the professor hadn't said anything about missing crystals, so he assumed that the old fool hadn't noticed. Other explanations now came to mind, most of them involving diabolical forms of retribution that took a week or so to set up.
Oh well, he mumbled. Like you said, very generous of him.
Very. And everybody says what a mean and miserly old git he is. Well, see you tomorrow then. Take care, she added as she swayed off down the street. All heels and hips, and 24 young stockbrokers forgot what they'd been about to say and stared until she was out of sight. Take care, she'd said. Was that just a conventional form of words meaning goodbye, or was it a warning? Maybe if he managed to get the crystals back to the professor's desk before he noticed. And how much was a 4-bedroom detached house in Surrey worth these days? 500,000? 3/4? Psst! Someone was standing on Paul's foot. Someone very small, because the whisper came from around about elbow height, but someone also very heavy, because his foot hurt quite a lot, and he couldn't move it for the weight. He looked down and saw a very short, very stocky little man in a raincoat 4 sizes too big for him. He was also wearing very dark shades, which he lifted for just a split second, revealing a pair of bright, blood-red eyes.
You're a goblin, Paul said.
The little man nodded. That's right, he said, and speak up. I think there's a bloke on the other end of the street who didn't hear you.
What? Oh, right. Sorry, but you are, aren't you? And
Right, yes, exactly. Actually, I'm your 3rd cousin, 8 times removed. Call me Colin.
If you like, Paul said. But what are you doing out here? You aren't supposed to wander about like this. You should be inside with the others.
Colin laughed. Screw that, he said. I don't belong to the colony. Actually, I'm a naturalised human like you, he added with a revolting grin. Paul knew better than to rise to that one.
Pleased to meet you, he said. Look, was there something? Only I really ought to be getting home.
Bollocks, Colin said. I was listening to you and our Rosie just now.
Oh, were you?
Colin nodded his oversized, noticeably pointed head. Heard some very interesting stuff about Vansby's crystals. About an aspirin bottle full.
Paul winced. Look, he said, I just decided I'm going to put it back where I got it from. Just don't...
Are you? Oh. Colin looked profoundly underconvinced. That'd be a real pity, really, because I just happen to know a bloke who knows a bloke who paid top dollar for a few grams of Vansby's crystals, provided that's what they really are, of course, he added with a slight scowl.
I'm pretty sure they are, Paul said. Only that's what it said on the label, and it was in Vansby's desk drawer.
Maybe, just possibly, he shouldn't have said that. Too late now, though. But Colin only grinned a bit wider. Easy enough to tell, he hissed. I mean, I could tell you right now if you happen to have them on you. As it happened, the bottle was in Paul's overcoat pocket, the one without the hole, and if Vansby knew about the hole, surely it stood to reason. A mental image of the professor, pale and shrunken, hopping around on all fours, muttering, "What has it got in its pockets?" slipped into his mind, and took quite a bit of getting rid of. "All right," Paul whispered back, "but not here. People think we're dealing drugs or something." For some reason, Colin seemed to think that was funny, but he nodded his head sideways. "Round the bank," he said. "Alleyway, couple of lock-up garages. I've got a key. Count 20 and follow me." Paul couldn't remember having seen an alleyway near the pub. In fact, he could have sworn it was an architectural impossibility, given the age and nature of the buildings. But apparently he was wrong. There was an alley, small and dark, like an American's visualization of Dickens, and halfway down it stood 2 small garages, so shabby as to be picturesque. The sliding door of one of them was open, and Colin beckoned to him as he approached. "Anybody follow you?" he muttered.
"Don't think so," Paul replied. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind. "Look, I'm not sure about this. Even if I'm going to keep the stuff, I don't think selling it would be terribly..."
"Quiet."
Colin peered up and down the alley a couple of times, then heaved the garage door down and flipped on a light. The garage was completely empty, apart from the few swatches of dusty cobwebs swathed across the walls like tinsel on a Christmas tree. If someone had hired Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen to decorate a garage in furtive noir, it couldn't have been more perfect.
"All right," he said. "Let's see stuff."
"Look."
"Please?"
Now the goblin was doing that sad, beseeching look, like a red-eyed puppy dog.
Come on, can't hurt. Let me just look at it, and I can tell you if it's a real thing or just coffee sugar.
There was that, of course. Paul was proposing to use the stuff in the recipe. If it turned out to be something else, like strychnine, that the professor had put in the jar as a merry prank, it might be as well to find out now rather than later. All right then, he said, and fished out the bottle. The effect on Colin was rather remarkable. A cross between someone finding a thick roll of banknotes in the street and Sir Lancelot kneeling before the Grail.
If that's the real deal, he said in a small wobbly voice, then that's a hell of a lot of crystals. Mind if I?
Paul shrugged. Whatever. Very carefully, Colin unscrewed the cap. He paused as though saying grace, and then drew a long, thin claw from the little finger of his left hand. He dipped the end of the claw into the bottle and licked it, and his face lit up with a sort of religious glow.
That's the stuff, he whispered. Definitely the stuff, all right.
He went on, pulling himself together with an almost audible snap.
Tell you what I'll do. Send your family, and I'll like you and everything. $1 million US cash, what do you reckon?
It was the look on Colin's face that made Paul's mind up for him, that frantic, almost haunted look of unbearable longing and greed. Sorry, Paul said, but it's going back. I just hope that the professor hasn't noticed it's gone. Colin winced as though someone had just stubbed out a cigarette in his ear.
Sorry, he said. Sorry. Serves me right for trying to rip off my own third cousin. What I meant to say was £2 million. For what's left, he added quickly, after you've had what you need for your medicine.
£2 million. 2 million useless, worthless pounds, because of course he'd never be able to spend it, not Paul Carpenter, who'd been sold to J.W. and could never quit. Mr. Tanner's mum had said you can buy anything, but she'd been wrong. Paul couldn't buy anything because he no longer owned himself.
With £3 million, Colin was saying quietly and insidiously, you could do a deal with them. Dennis's lot, with $3.5 million, he went on.
He was sweating slightly, Paul noticed.
You could buy yourself.
Paul hadn't thought of that. How much was he worth to the partnership exactly? He knew how much they'd paid for him, $425,000, enough to buy Paul's parents their Florida home and their Winnebago. Would $3.5 million strike them as a good deal or not? How could he possibly be worth more than that to anybody? Even on a good day, he wasn't worth 20 quid and bucket stamps to himself.
When I said 3.5, Colin said, I was just kidding. 4.25, I shouldn't say.
But even a real idiot, a worthless clown like Paul Carpenter, knew better than to offer to buy anything from the partnership with their own money, and all he had to do was look into Colin's eyes to know that the stuff in the bottle wasn't going to do him any good, rather the reverse in fact. Sorry, he said, I don't think so. For a moment, Paul was sure that the goblin was going to attack, and that'd be that, he thought. Goblins being ferocious natural killers, armed with claws like razors and teeth like needles. Instead, however, Colin handed him the bottle and shrugged. A few tiny specks of greyish-white powder were scattered around the neck of the bottle. Paul quickly wiped them away with his cuff.
Can't blame a bloke for trying, Colin said. If you change your mind, Rosie will tell you where to find me. Look after yourself, right?
Then he snapped his fingers. The garage seemed to burst like a balloon, and Paul found himself standing outside the pub. The crowd had gone. He was holding an empty glass, in which someone had dropped a cigarette end. And it had started to rain.